Welcome to Episode 3, Season 2 of Reflections on Music and Nature. My guests for this episode are Allyssa Schmidt and Alli Ross, both artists and professors at the Boston Conservatory at Berklee. Allyssa Schmidt is, like me, a native of Greater Sacramento in California. Her artistic and teaching work focuses on theatrical production dramaturgy and climate change activism, with a particular focus on the intersection of science and storytelling. She has also served as director-dramaturg for 5 iterations of climate change theater action, an international series of readings and performances which coincide with the United Nations Conference of the Parties. Alli Ross is a dance theater artist, movement director, and founding member of the Boston-based interdisciplinary performance collective Excavate, which is dedicated to researching, making, and performing site work looking at the interconnection of topography and history of land and its relation to the body. Some of her performance credits include the original cast of Healing Wars with Liz Lerman and the US premiere of Sleep No More with UK's Punch Drunk at American Repertory Theatre. During my first year teaching at Berklee, I was really lucky to receive a cold email from Alli and Alyssa inviting me to be part of their research group at Berklee called Coastal Climate for Change. The Berklee-funded group included other students and faculty members and focused on the intersection of art, science, policymaking, and pedagogy with an emphasis on our own locale, the Boston shoreline. We got to meet with scientists from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, Climate Ready Boston, and artists of Superhero Clubhouse from New York City. The first time I met Alli and Alyssa was by Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. When Alli suggested that we record this interview there, I had to do it. Alli and Alyssa are 2 of the smartest people I've met and are constantly reimagining ways of teaching and art making that can help us grapple with the upsetting realities of our time while also embracing a sense of joy and playfulness in the work they do. Since we recorded by the pond trail, you're going to hear some ambient sounds, some wind, some water sounds, and you're also going to hear some very disruptive sounds like conversations or helicopters. I hate to speak for my guests, but I feel pretty confident saying that they would want me to embrace the messy elements of recording in an uncontrolled space. And I invite you to do the same as you're listening. Please enjoy. Yep. Okay, good. Hi guys, welcome.
Hello, Ryan.
Good to see you. This is Allyssa Schmidt here, and Alli Ross, both very good friends, and we actually met each other for the first time here in Walden Pond, Massachusetts, which is where we are now. Thank you both so much for making the time to hang out and to talk about your craft. So before we kind of get into our projects together and our relationship, I'd like to ask each of you maybe I'll start with Alyssa here. Tell me about your relationship to the natural world as a person, and what does nature mean to you? It's a really big question.
So full disclosure, the topic in my eco-performance class this week was what is nature? Mm-hmm. And I pulled up a textbook definition, and it talked about encompassing everything in the external world. Something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing, but it made clear that it was centering humans and then separating humans from what might be considered nature. So I very much think about how can we disentangle ourselves from that really culturally developed. Some of us have a culturally developed sense of nature that creates a separation between humans and more than human nature.
It's like a false binary.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that excludes things like the built environment. It perpetuates notions of like a so-called untouched wilderness that's rife with settler colonialist ideals and erases indigenous genocide and all of it. So to be much more simple about it, I'd say I think of my relationship to the natural world as one of a process, and how am I in relationship to any and all of those processes. So for example, one way I feel like to disentangle from that binary of the human-nature divide is to not think of nature as something that's far away from me at all, that it's everywhere I am, that it's not a binary of like, is it beautiful or not beautiful?
Yeah.
And that helps me when I'm taking the compost out after a long day
Yeah.
at work, go like, this is it, and it's gross. And there's nothing in my life that hasn't changed relative to like death positivity, for example, right?
Wow.
I'm not saying I'm there at all yet, and I catch myself, especially on my use of language, when I think about the natural world. But in the immediate, I'm in relationship to gardening and farming and waterways, and in particular in a very wet summer, beginning of fall, what does it mean to be in a teeming relationship with water, even though the tomatoes were a little watery this year, just as an example, right? Like if I take a bite, how do I not look down on that and instead be like, okay, that's evidence of a process.
Sure. So you're experiencing something like visceral, but then also, you know, I guess maybe intellectualizing it, or maybe that's the wrong word. But maybe like considering the meaning behind it, and you know, the broader context of like, you know, oh, there's a drought this year, there's a heavy rain season this year, and like I think I would imagine that your proximity to, you know, your gardening activities and kind of your physical closeness to nature is a big part of that, because you work in Boston, but then you live in kind of a rural area, like out, you know, an hour plus drive outside of the city, which is a very beautiful place.
Yeah, and I again have to discourage myself from letting that be binary, or I'll just be like a grumpy teacher all day long.
It can be hard to, I think, it's easy for it to feel binary, especially when, like, you know, you're in the classroom, you're trying to do a thing. I feel like you guys are really good at this, and I'm always trying to learn this from you, of like trying to not separate those things. It's very easy to fall into that feeling of like, I'm in the classroom doing this one thing, now I'm outside, and now I'm enjoying nature, you know, and there's that disconnect.
I'll give you one example. So another part of my life, I think, that helps me connect to the natural world is just through my child's eyes. And my child goes to a school that centers place-based learning and eco-literacy. And so they came home the other day and we're talking about how like they're in the middle of doing something around theme, which is one of the titles of a subject of study, but got really interested in a pileated woodpecker's nest. And then I brought that up with the teacher at back to school night, and they said, well, absolutely, like even if we're focusing on a certain subject of study, that doesn't mean we're not going to like take pause to honor where we are.
It's so refreshing. It's amazing.
So that influenced me to later that week, when it started pouring rain in this really beautiful mellifluous pattern outside, to just stop and say, and not say, oh, sorry, I'm distracted, but instead just be in that.
That's really
in
beautiful.
that old 8th of Fenway building where you can't ignore noise.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just part of the soundscape.
It's there. Alli, same question to you. Your own relationship with nature, and like personally, and how you kind of think of what nature is.
Yeah, well, something we were just talking about that made me, that brought me to a very clear memory in terms of like my connection to nature as an educator, is that every Tuesday for the last 3 years, it's rained in the afternoon. Almost every single Tuesday. I think yesterday was the first Tuesday it didn't rain. And I've had students over the years like name that, because there was this one window in my classroom in Hemingway, and we would always just like honor the darker sky. And I loved that, because it became this motif of sorts that we could comment on and be in relationship to. On my way to class yesterday, in a classroom that has no windows, I was aware that it wasn't raining, and I was like, oh, but that's interesting. There's no window from the classroom to allow me to kind of continue to observe, or like be in relationship to it while I'm teaching. So that's like, with my educator hat on, I think a lot about weather systems and feel it inform how people enter the space, the classroom setting, the more formal classroom setting. as an artist and a dancer, my relationship to nature is something that's developed over time. Where like in my 20s, I got really interested in how the landscape of a more rural environment, or like the edge of this rock, how that actually allowed or like played with body contouring and weight exchange. And so I spent a lot of time in my 20s like actually like reclaiming that like my body was a landscape, and it was in relationship to all these different forms of matter, whether it be water or rock or soil. And so that was like an incredibly formative time, I think, for my for like me recognizing that I was part of, like kind of in relation to what you're saying, like part of that I am not separate from, but I am in relationship to. And then over the years, because I am more of a city-based person, I have found that when I am in relationship to larger, expansive places in nature, my breathing changes, the way I'm allowed, or the way I give myself permission to move in space changes. I actually now feel more like I want to dance in nature more than in like studio spaces that are deemed rehearsal spaces. I don't always feel moved to move in those spaces. So that's been like an interesting thing to really like be honest with in myself. Like nature actually makes me want to dance, and so my work has often brings me outside and is more sight based, because that's where I feel most inspired. So I have like all these little vignettes I've made over the years, like in relationship to a tree or a field of grass. And it's interesting to look back on some of that material and go like, well, okay, how does that live on? Or how, you know, what is my relationship to that now? Or do I still go to that field? You know, is that a moment in the past? Or do I still have a relationship with that land today? So that's, I would say, some of the ways in which I feel very, very connected and in relationship to nature.
It makes a lot of sense. It's fascinating, like you mentioned the dance spaces, you know, in these buildings, which a lot of money is spent to make sure that, you know, okay, so there's a dance program, it's a theater, right? That is designed, you know, which we, as artists, we would consider a good thing, like to have a space specifically designated for art making. But then ironically, it's like that space can feel very stuffy and conducive to like just one kind of form. And it's fascinating the way that, you know, because like as a dancer, you're concerned with movement of the body, and like the way that you talk about the body like extending and interacting with not even just nature, but one's surroundings. Maybe like it seems like both of you have in mind a broader definition of what we mean when we talk about nature. We really mean like our environment, our immediate environment, which could be an urban environment, but in this case, like where we are now, it's a very kind of, you know, untouched, but yet it is actually very touched because we have trails around this pond. And
may I offer something?
Yeah, please.
What if we took a word like land, and instead of, again, it being external and, I think 10 years ago I thought of it as just, it's the ground under my feet. So it's about me, right?
Right.
And what if it included actually like every living thing, every geological feature, right? The way the wind is interacting with all of those elements. And something I just want to honor in Alli and in my relationship to you is, you mentioned intellectual. Yes, I tend to intellectualize things.
Me too.
But there would be ways back when we were co-teaching where I might describe something and I was working my way toward how are these often literal elements in relationship to each other. And Alli was the first person to say, Alyssa, you're thinking choreographically, right? Like you're actually talking about, if not your, like a body, you know, human bodies moving in space and relative to these things. And that really is part of that project for me, right? Of like relationship to isn't just an intellectual thing. It doesn't mean I have to make myself smaller. In fact, sometimes it's about getting out of the developed in the modern era theatrical notion that an audience is having an interior experience, because as you dim the lights, you just go inside your head. And what's actually been lost by not having open air, reliance on sunlight.
And also like that element of chance, which I think is counterintuitive to some of the ways we've learned.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you have to rehearse this, and this is the sequence, and
you want to eliminate X factors.
Right.
Like ideally someone in the audience would not, have a nervous breakdown or be rustling their paper, or and still I prefer not to have those things. I prefer silent. But then you're both talking about this kind of the way that we are trained in a way, in school, of the audience is here, the lights are dim, you focus on the thing that is on stage, and that's the world.
Well, yeah, and
trying to control it in a way.
It's about framing, right? The way that you frame something will change how people experience it. And so yes, if we're looking through a keyhole, or if we're looking through, we're in a proscenium environment, then that will, you are training someone's eye or perception to go that direction. But the minute you open it up, like you're saying, changing the way the light comes in, or changing the environment that you're in, you're giving people an opportunity, I think, to expand the notion of what is, of everything. What am I part of? What's holistic? What is taking away from this experience? What is adding to it? It's a larger constellation, and I think about this a lot, in relationship to what audiences need, dramaturgically, and what are we creating for right now? And that's really interesting to think about when we take a piece and say, why is it here in this space?
Yeah.
Or why could we see it here, or could it travel there?
And how are we inviting them in? And actually, are we codifying the notion of needing to be invited? Right?
Yeah.
But I can't tell you how many times I've overheard in what might be called an immersive experience, somebody may be saying, oh, I don't like that, or oh, I'm a part of this now, I'm being really startled. But I think it relates back to the first day I have with students, when they realize their relationship to nature is it's out there, it's beyond me.
Yeah, and it brings up this notion too of authorship, maybe, in a way. Also, if we're framing, and the frame is I think that's such a great metaphor. Maybe it's kind of literal and metaphorical too. When we talk about framing, there's the thing that we're supposed to focus on, and I feel having something to focus on is important. But then the context completely alters the experience too. In a controlled kind of traditional theatrical environment, it's meant to just only focus everything on this one thing. We kind of control everything around it. Whereas if we're outdoors, I saw your videos with Excavate, where you're actually performing in a setting not so different from this one that we're in now. Where, and that was fascinating, because what it means is you're making a piece of art, but then that art is also in interaction with the rest of the surrounding, which you are not really able to control. And I think accepting that, and maybe having some humility to say I didn't make this, and I could never dream to make anything like this, and that's okay, I play a small part, or you play a small part, you play a small part in the artistic piece, but then being humble enough to say I'm not this singular solitary genius, which is kind of a myth anyway. It's not really, it's a myth. It doesn't reflect how art making actually works. And so to lean into this, leaning into spontaneity, and leaning into really listening, which you guys are great at, listening to one's surroundings, is it's hard to do. Maybe we can talk a little bit about Coastal Climate for Change, which was the kind of, I guess you could call it a research group. It's always difficult to explain, but it's really beautiful and amazing collaboration that we had together through Boston Conservatory and Berklee College, which, for those unfamiliar with the system, are kind of merged together. So maybe, Alyssa, why don't you tell us about, or both of you are welcome to kind of jump in and explain how this started, and who was involved, and what kind of the goals are, if we can even talk about goals.
Sure. This is the meet cute, right?
Yeah.
We were sitting in my backyard.
Yes, we were. It was a hot day.
Summer day? Early summer.
Early summer.
And we had just, we were processing a gorgeous experience co-teaching a class that was already in collaboration with and in relationship to oceanographic science. Is that fair?
Yeah.
And the specific topic of microplastics.
Hello, Aunt.
Oh, hello. I've taught a class for a long time called Eco Performance. Alli, you teach a class
Called Theater and Community Arts Practice.
and I, speaking from the eye, have felt like I get these little fits and bursts of my own creativity that I sublimate right into supporting student work, and hadn't had a lot of time, hadn't made a lot of time working on my language aspects. I hadn't prioritized
Sure. Yeah.
my own creative practice, and I feel like we got this taste of that through watching our students practice, through watching them work with a wonderful company called Superhero Clubhouse in a workshop that we were able to repeat and enjoy again.
They're fantastic. Yeah.
And Alli, you beautifully pointed out that if we were going to do that and try to like hold that space, that maybe we could seek institutional support.
We were like, wait, this is a big idea. Like, this is a really big idea, and we can see so many different people and partnerships perhaps developing from it or within it. So, yes, could the school support that? And, you know, and like in a division that, you know, was in flux at the time, it was like, could we think about this more holistically and like work with people across the institution, because that's really what this is about, right? It's like creating a larger dialogue around such a big topic, which specifically was like, we boiled it down over time to like really looking at, you know, specifically being a coastal city. But I think that we were initially thinking, you know, aspects of climate justice, and we were kind of leading in this piece around microplastics that we had researched the previous semester. So it was this kind of great moment of like, oh, let's see what we can do, and we found this grant called the Faculty-Led Innovation Grant that allowed us to support fellow faculty, some students, and we got to meet quite regularly throughout the year. I think your question was around like, what was our research, you know, specifically?
Or something about that. So to boil it down to like a question that was really motivating, I think us both, is where are we? So I think a lot about how, just again back in reference to modern drama, there's been a lot of focus on the question being, who am I? So coming back to that idea of how do you decenter anthropocentrism, right? How do you exist more in relationship to? How do you unsettle the idea of the singular genius? That can be a pedagogical and intellectual exercise. How do you actually use it generatively in creative practice? And I love that you said research and then paused and kind of had a quizzical attitude toward that word, because I love practice as research, but I'm now realizing it's like, can I put the two words over each other, like put it through the typewriter again and like practice research like on top of each other?
Yeah.
So in asking where are we, that touches on our relationship to institution, and that we're often not given or unable to hold that space to really think about anything other than the immediate. Is the tech working in my classroom, right?
Yeah.
How many minutes do I have to get to the next classroom space? But with the addition of something like a land acknowledgement into a syllabus, how do you exist actually in literal relationship to that? How do you let that inform how you walk into the space, like what you said?
And not just something that's tacked on in the syllabus and like, okay, we take 2 minutes for like a land acknowledgement, and then it's interesting, like the idea of the land acknowledgement, it's like, so it's a great idea, you know, it comes from like a good place, but it's become now this thing of like where people just do it, they recite it, and then like, okay, we did that, and there isn't, at least for me, like I have a hard time seeing how, I mean, maybe even just, I don't know, maybe just the awareness is the first step, but of course it's not enough, but it's better than nothing, you know, like, anyway.
Well, and it's, I think, so essential to name that where we teach was once water.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. And to acknowledge that there is a history of where we are, I mean, I think that immediately puts me in, that immediately is another kind of orientation, right? Like, oh, I am here right now in 2023, and I have lived here for 20 years, but before that, there was someone else doing this, and doing all of this, and oh, I'm in a room of all these people, and where were they before, you know, so it gives me a relationship to time as well as a relationship to place, and I think that that's like, I love thinking about different ways of orienting.
Framing, maybe.
Yeah, it's another framing tool, right? Another way of categorizing, which is maybe a consumerist term, I'm not sure, actually, I just thought that, but like, yeah, like the way, or different ways of like framing things. I like that better. And I think that a word would be like praxis search. Like,
Yeah.
like, because it's like maybe it's praxis versus practice, and or maybe that just flows off the tongue.
Yeah.
But like practice search.
Yeah. And to invite listeners
Yeah.
in, I remember the energy in the room when we all met, many of us for the first time in body, right, in person. And Alli and I said, so we're not going to tell you what to do. We don't have an ideal product in mind.
Yeah.
And that was disorienting in a way, when as soon as you leave that room, at least from my perspective, I'm beholden to the next meeting, prepping the next lesson, grading, you know, a paper.
That weekly accountability of teaching is the thing that makes it really hard to prioritize your craft and your art making, as you both mentioned, like to make the time for it, to prioritize it. Like I struggle with that a lot. I think a lot of people do who are involved in teaching, like because with art making, like we kind of want it to be fluid, and when things are fluid, it's too easy for them to get out of the way for, I mean, teaching, which of course is important too, but like the pie chart of time that I spend is not always what I want it to be, you know what I mean? Yeah.
It was every time we got in the room together last year, I had this little tickle or like something in my belly of like, what's gonna happen today, right? Like, how are we all gonna meet in this space today? And I think that for me, that was always an indication that like I was at some kind of growing edge in myself, to be in relationship to all of you in this deepening way, and something was going to happen, like to trust, you know, we say trust the process, and that, like I felt like, okay, we're trusting each other, we're building relationship, and we're orienting to one another, and then we're orienting to like what we care about, and then that led us to actually, I remember like last December, like getting to this real concept of like, okay, how do we orient more to the past, the present, and the future of this location of where we are, as citizens and as artists.
And can I call up the specific gifts that it was to be among different artists?
The
Yes,
interdisciplinary
please.
aspect,
I think
so good.
I think all the time about senses, and I actually I probably floated a little bit above and away from the conversation a moment ago when you were talking about audience. I almost blurted out, and spectator, right? There's been changes in words that are the normative way of describing somebody who's witnessing, right? A show.
And to what extent are they participating or not participating?
Well, that, and then participate makes me think more about the body. Spectator makes me think more about sight. Audience is rooted more in the ear. Charades.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful distinction of those three.
So thinking about that and realizing that, like, I actually think that's one of the strongest muscles, so to speak, we can cultivate around addressing climate instability as artists, is to say, like, we have limited human senses. I love reading about non-human animal senses to learn more. It's very humbling and brings a new sense of wonder to the world for me. But then I think, well, you right, compose, you hear things profoundly differently. Sophia, one of our student members, consistently brought in found sound, and I started hearing things differently as a result. And then when we began to juxtapose some of those things, right? Like Kerrigan, another student participant, sees things differently. What does it mean when you bring those things together? again, not necessarily saying, have we made a thing yet? What's this thing?
Right, right.
But can we actually process experiences differently, start to walk around in the world a bit differently?
I'm really curious, like, about this. Like, I know that process is like leaning into process as being very important. Like, I think most of us would agree that like the process itself of, you know, art making maybe doesn't get the attention that it deserves, or maybe it gets kind of, you know, we want to make this shiny thing, and like this ugly, unglamorous stuff. Like, I mean, it's not really ugly, but you know, most of us like are focused on that like goal or the product or the destination. It's very teleological, like very kind of goal oriented. But I wonder like what you both see as, like, do you see process as kind of the thing itself that doesn't need a goal, or maybe is it a matter of like having there be a goal so that a process can exist? Because that's something I've been thinking about a lot. Like, maybe the goal isn't that important, but it still needs to exist. Does that make sense? Like, so, or maybe not. Maybe you don't feel that way. Maybe it's not necessary to even have a product. I'm not sure if that makes sense. But like, what's the relationship of those things, like process and product? Like, you know, to what extent do they actually need each other, and to what extent maybe we can just get rid of the idea of product? I don't know. I'm curious about what you think.
Well, I feel like when I think of it, this brings me into like some philosophical conversation around performance studies. Like, you know, can you make something, and if it never has an audience, or never has a spectator, or never has a witness, did it happen? You know, like that kind of dialogical relationship is like really fascinating to me, and so I've grown to like really be interested in how we exist in process. And I think it depends. I think sometimes we need to have that goal in order to work around it and through it, but I don't think that process is linear to that goal, or that it has to be linear. I think that's where sometimes like the ideas around process maybe get a bit narrow in some conversations. It's like, how far out can your research go, and then still like somehow get yourself to that
that destination, and then there's a paper, there's a presentation, and then like boom, now it's
right. Like, one of my dearest mentors of all time, I talk to you about her all the time, Liz Lerman, who just like, yeah, she's been really acknowledged for her work around process. I was making a piece about my grandfather, and about like my Jewish identity, but also around how melody is passed down over time. And she was like, well, have you considered going to the kosher butcher? And like, have you thought about like these parts of research that can exist like outside of a paradigm of the actual content that you are making, but like it's going to inform somehow,
and without putting pressure on it too.
Right, and that's where I really want to just advocate for like long form process, right? That if we have a longer process with each other, we have more time to be in those maybe parts of ourselves or parts of our process towards a goal that we would never have gotten to otherwise, you know. Yeah, go ahead.
And sometimes that is a matter of adaptation to the systems that are already in place.
Sure,
right?
Totally.
So I'll speak as an eco-dramaturg, I guess,
please.
just to explain that my handy metaphor or analogy for what a dramaturg does is they're kind of like a story doula. They help them be born, but aren't actually doing the birthing, or aren't giving birth. And so as a dramaturg, I'm often like, so to speak, behind the scenes, doing a lot of research. So the process starts really early on, ideally in relationship to, you know, the devisers within an ensemble, or a director, or even a playwright in new play development. So eco-dramaturgy adds this beautiful layer of, is the whole ecosystem of this process healthy, right? So we work a lot with musical theater students, and so I talk a lot, if they say like, do you think that was a beautiful show? I will often say, well, was it, you know, beautifully and ethically made, right? Let's really like pull at the roots there. So one example that comes to mind is in our EPL, so our first co-teaching collaboration. I was able to prepare for a workshop with students around tempo and scale relative to non-human animal life. I was working with a biologist, an oceanographer, who is it wasn't comfortable for him to immediately think about his work in relationship to creativity until I started to tell him that he was telling stories that exceeded the wonder that I get from watching superhero movies, right? Like, there are like creatures that exist that are amazing. Anyway, to be more concise, there was an exercise we did that had to do with like really thinking about what it is to be a whale. And
I remember that day so clearly. Yes.
There were balls like from a ball pit. The students were figuring out how to move together because they realized, like, I'm not a whale. Are you a whale? Like, could we whale together?
Right. How could
whale
we
as verb?
Oh, yeah. Can we whale together? Yes. And then they created that like whole long formation with all of their bodies as a group. That was really
thinking differently about plastics consumption as well. And a year and a half later, so 6 seasons, right? One of those students wrote a piece in my eco-performance class that was, the prompt was around Augusta Boal's newspaper theater techniques.
Oh, yeah.
And it brought whale back in. And this student, they had something in their body that came back from that. It was like this echo or like conjuring of a ghost from that exercise, right?
Yes.
And I'm actually already thinking about next week. There's a way that like that student won't even be there, but I learned something through that I know I'm going to bring into the space.
Wow.
So was that that was all funded, that all had one name as a project?
Right.
No, but that's the only way I can think about your question. Process in relationship to product is it's actually like 2 different ways of experiencing time.
Maybe it's the non-linear thing is the thing that's helping me understand, because I think usually we think in very linear terms.
Yeah, I mean, body time is not linear.
But you can come back. You can go. There can be a product, and then the process happens. They're like side by side, and like okay, there's a product where we go to sometimes, and then it gets influenced by a process, and it's changing, and it's not staying the same.
Yes, it's that non-stasis, right? And like embracing it like, oh, I really don't know. I really don't know. Curious. I'm so curious. I'm going to be in my curiosity, and I'm going to keep meeting that.
And we're going to
talk about that so much last year. Yeah,
we're going to come back to one of the experiences, right? Like kind of moments within the process that we developed and did invite others into, hopefully for Be Taught, the conference at Berklee. And I don't even know what questions we will have at the center then. But that's what I'm getting from what you're saying too, that like sometimes actually the questions that come out of something are the fuel for like the next thing, or the next step.
Yes, I think so. In like iterations, right? Iterations.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm curious, like for you in composing music, right? Like there must be so many iterations of pieces you're working on, or at least your relationship to a piece. That change over time. Maybe you can hear how you want to play it somewhere further off in the distance, and yet you're right where you are. I don't know.
I mean that's a great point. I think the more that I get the chance to interact with theater people, the more the more I interact with theater people, the more I realize that like a flexible attitude, and like an attitude of like it's this thing that can change, and it's messy. Like I try to embrace that more, and it's better for my own mental health, and it's also better for the like. I mean, I'm okay with calling it the artistic product, like the composition or the performance that happens, right? And that is going to change over time, and like I'm less precious about like, well, you know, if like my partner's a pianist and she has great suggestions all the time. If she says something like, hey, maybe, you know, add octaves here, or maybe we don't need this section, or maybe cut this. I give it serious thought, and I think, you know what, it wasn't my idea, but it makes the piece better, so let's just do it. and like
maybe
put my
those
ego
pieces
aside.
are gonna like become compost for something else. You
Exactly,
know what I mean?
sure.
Like you probably don't just hit delete and put in a trash can right away. Like, do you
No,
save?
I mean, I always save drafts. I never literally throw anything away, but like I almost never return to it either.
And like it's really a postmodern concept, in at least in theater and dance, like to decompose or deconstruct and allow that to be as much of the process as anything else. And we can relate to that so much in we think about our environmental efforts, specifically around repurposing and recycling and all
There's a
the
connection.
movements around there. There's a total connection, right? Found objects, how we use them. It's about being resourceful, or like what does that mean to be resourceful? So like it's like the puzzle pieces.
I think the way we are thinking about art making and like kind of how we share the art that we make with other people, like that, all of that, I think that mindset or that way of thinking, it's different from how I think a lot of us were trained in a kind of conservatory style, more like 20th century mindset of like almost like clinical, where you come up with this thing and that's the thing and now it's there, and this is like this idea of the urtext, like the score that is perfection and you cannot be changed or altered. Like it's a mythology, at least definitely in classical music, that exists, and like it's not very helpful. And I think having this more flexible attitude and the willingness to change things and to and definitely to set one's ego aside, to decenter oneself in the process, all of that is an important mindset that can bleed over in how we like tackle the environmental crisis that we're in now, right? Or it can be. It's maybe very subtle and not obvious, and people may think like, oh, what is this actually? How is this helping? Like, what are you guys doing? Like, you're making art and stuff, and that sounds nice, but like, what is it actually doing? But really, I think it's part of like a cultural change that's desperately needed, in my opinion.
Yeah, maybe we could like speak a little bit about. I don't know, I guess I'm thinking about like Coastal Climate for Change working group and like where we felt we landed, or where we felt we kind of what we found out of it, in the last, or maybe it's still going, because it is, and like I guess you talked about this a little bit, but like the idea that it's not over.
I mean, this right now, this whole conversation,
is
right,
like
is a
part
continuation
of that,
of
and it's just
that.
like this. It's like sometimes this contradictory thing that comes in when the semester ends. You think, okay, I only got here, or wow, yay, we got here, right? That celebratory or deficit like idea of like, okay, I got this far, and then the semester ends, and there's this right, there's like this breath and this spaciousness, and I often got used to think like, okay, boom, it's over, or like that's the end of a project on the semester schedule. But with Coastal Climate for Change, I have actually felt that spaciousness is like the beat, or the rest musically, like
or the
we
breath,
think about
or something,
the process being a longer, just continuing onward, and that just because that constellation of people might not be able to fit in a room together, again, like how do we continue to meet it with that curiosity, right? And I feel like we've noted that a couple times this summer when we've talked. So yeah, I think I'm just honoring that, or getting back to that idea that like it's not over. It's just the beginning, and how are we going to make change with it, or how are we going to? We might not ever know how it's going to change anything, but that we know that by being with one another, in relationship to one another, something has physically and chemically changed.
Coming back to the idea of language, I find this really intimidating to think about, but I'm excited, so I want to lean into it. To me, it's about like, how do we meet each other again and differently, right? Not differently for the sake of difference, but that the greatest compliment I can give to the work, whatever that is will I hear something differently and kind of notice your presence and your presence in your absence, and maybe tell you more often about those things, those moments, and not fight. I'm trying to disentangle from language around violence in my vocabulary, but disentangle a bit from the expectation if we meet again to say, oh, so the thing we did, what else can we do? Right? As if it's like some lump of clay in the center of the table we have to like further mold.
Totally, yes.
And think more about, for example, since this project existed somewhat in relationship to Boston Climate Ready and those projects, like giving ourselves the grace and the time to actually learn where those projects are now.
Right, and those are infrastructure projects in the city of Boston, you know, and we got to hear like policymakers and, you know, advocates talk about that process, and that was also very humbling for me too, of just thinking about all the different stakeholders that have to come together and to, like, I think, you know, we read about these things in the news and we know, you know, like on a surface level, but to hear someone in it, you know, and to hear like about their kind of day-to-day experience as well as the kind of big ideas that they have and how they're implementing them, like that was, there's so many moving parts, and it's very interdisciplinary too.
I think a lot about what we learned from that project, so a workshop specifically with Superhero Clubhouse, called an eco-performance lab, inclusive of scientists and city policymakers and artists, and about how the projects we learned about specifically are holding multiple things to be true, like the development of infrastructure and rewilding. And I'm not quite sure where I want to go with this, other than I feel like that's something that's now influenced my thinking about dramaturgy, right? Like sometimes it is about coming in and like clarifying the definition of certain words in a text, right? And like helping an actor along. The stage manager in the room is responsible for like normative time, right? Like time for a break.
Normative time, not the way we think of time.
But then there's what gets called table work, right? In like, again, a normative production of a text-based theater piece, and conversations about it and around it and in it. And how can we work toward a holistic way of valuing each part of those maybe non-linear ways, right? Even as I'm saying this, I'm remembering that like table work is usually squished into the beginning of a process. I'm not quite sure where my brain is now, but that whole...
it's really interesting because you made me think of Cornerstone Theater, and it's just an ensemble based in LA at this point, but they worked on a project years and years ago with in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, with the steel workers there and the community as the steel industry was kind of coming to a close and the factories were shutting down. And a way that they developed that script, speaking of ecosystems and how far out ecosystems, you know, how can a process hold multiple truths, and how can a process hold the many perspectives that exist on a given topic, that like they wrote the script and then like left it in coffee shops, and like left it out in libraries, and like left it out in public spaces for people to find and read and like give feedback on. And
with contact information, or
I mean, like and then they had table work like across so many different sectors, and so it's just this other way, or like another example of how to a tactic for like engaging aspects of community practice and like feeding, nourishing ecosystems or multiple truths.
I love that, because again, it's that idea of like, how can you remove self-consciousness from the invitation?
That's a big,
right?
That's a big goal.
And actually show through that quite actively, like, let's say it's at a coffee shop, like, I value your caffeinated state, right? I value that you're here, like, nourishing yourself through having some food, and this is here. But there's no burdensome ask. There's nothing extractive about that.
And that's largely about the environment, right? That the script is found in.
And the context.
And the context, like that brings us back to like where we started around man-made environments versus
framing,
natural environments, and like how you create non-pressured invitations.
And do you and like, are you gonna fight the thing that are you gonna like push against it and resist it, or are you gonna try and collaborate with it and work with it and listen to it? And I think the best productions are the ones that, I mean, even kind of the traditional theatrical spaces, like I've seen some like we have a friend in Sacramento, Jake Gutierrez Montoya, who I've got to work with sometimes, and he's a theater guy, choreographer, and he's done some productions in some weird spaces that are kind of small and stuff, but then like he uses the space in such a way that, I mean, I'm sure you've both experienced this like in theater too, where it's like, oh, like, you know, most people would look at this and say, this is terrible, you can't work in here. And then, but instead, like, how do you look at that and say like, oh, let me just kind of bring out what is working with it and work with it, you know?
That's adaptation again,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's so important.
You can fight it or not.
Yeah, my mindset has totally shifted in 10 years from
Yeah.
mitigation, right? Like
Sure.
stopping, fighting climate change
Yeah.
to actually like humility and adaptation.
Yeah.
And that in order to both honor work that has always been done
Yeah.
in
Right,
relationship to the more than human natural world, and also to I grew up with the reduce, reuse, recycle, and then
Sure,
only
yeah.
in the last decade also heard the fourth R, like refuse. How often does convenience
Yeah.
not actually mean more easeful?
Yeah.
When does it mean more entangled, more
Like,
dependent?
why do we need everything right now? I'm really curious, like in both of your kind of approaches to art making that is kind of in collaboration with nature, which is again a strange term, like a broad term, or even just the environment. Like, are there approaches that you found that were problematic or unsatisfying or ineffective? And maybe on a related note, like how has your approach developed over time? So like, yeah, things that have been problematic or unsatisfying, and then how your approach has changed. You mentioned that a little bit already.
Can I ask you a little bit more about what you mean by the word unsatisfying?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, like maybe you make something, and you just felt you were trying to go for, you had a goal or an idea in mind that you wanted to see, but when the whole thing was over, you weren't happy with it.
May I have permission to adapt your question?
Yeah, please.
I think I feel more comfortable talking about like surprise that maybe was like disappointment adjacent.
Not
Is
a
that
positive,
okay?
sure. So like surprise. I feel like we've been talking about surprise, like the joy of spontaneity and surprise. But I'm also like,
Yeah.
we're just, you know,
Yeah.
I'm curious about the kind of more negative side of that.
Yeah, I think the part of the reason I'm adapting it is I want to be really generous and thoughtful and humble about anyone I've ever collaborated with.
Sure.
And
sure.
so if the project I'm on is to make sure everything is thought of as a process, I feel like to say I'm unsatisfied is to like
It's too
lay
broad,
blame
maybe.
on those collaborators. But I'm thinking about the first really like squarely climate themed play that I worked on is called Sila by the wonderful playwright Chantal Bilodeau, who's committed nothing short of her life to a whole cycle of plays set in the Arctic. She always works with at least one indigenous collaborator, and so she does a lot of like field research, and has shifted the name to her project. It's now Arts and Climate Initiative, and they're one of the co-producers actually of Climate Change Theater Action. So this was the first of her plays in that cycle, and it premiered at Central Square Theater in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I remember really feeling humbled and disappointed when I learned that actually the inclusion of the phrase climate change in the marketing, many among the marketing and development team felt strongly that actually led to like ticket sales dropping.
Because they like, continue, like why was that?
That there were some subscribers who wrote in or spoke up, that I spoke with as a dramaturg at the show, about how they thought, well, I don't want to come to the theater and be,
Sounds depressing.
Yeah, sounds really depressing.
Yeah.
I'll be bummed out. It'll be scary. So that, and actually also what just popped up into my brain is when Chantal changed the name of the project from the Arctic Cycle to Arts and Climate Initiative, now I believe they can no longer advertise on Facebook because the word climate is seen as political. So
is
like
that real? The climate, that's...
I believe so.
Wow.
Maybe we can put it in the notes.
Yeah.
Like, just make sure. Fact check me on
Right,
this.
yeah, sure.
But she recently shared that that's a
becomes political.
a mode of access, right? And of like communication that's been closed. And so in that, I deeply believe language shapes, you know, how we are in the world, let alone how we see
Sure.
and move around in it. That was disappointing, although to compost that got really stinky, and I realized that sometimes labeling things is the thing that might turn people away
Totally.
or off, right? As opposed to like, if nature includes us and is everything, then why would you even have to put right? Like,
why are
climate
people
is
environmentalists?
everything.
Why are there people who say like, oh yeah, you're so interested in environmentalism? It's like, aren't you interested in being alive? You know, aren't you interested in the world not dying?
There's,
Like,
there's a meme about environmentalism that's like, wow, you're really into this. Why? And somebody says like, because I live there.
Yeah. I don't know where you live, but here, you know, it matters what happens to this place.
It's like that. It's kind of the same question, or like what you're saying. It brings me to this question of like disciplines, right? That like it's a very classical notion that we like have this discipline, and you learn this, and then you might learn ballet, and then you'll over here is music, and over here is dance, and they're boxes, right? And again, like categories help sometimes, and but in terms of like the way in which we label, you know, labels can be helpful, but they also can be quite limiting, and so I just was thinking about that in terms of like how we seek change, or how our perspective or language around how to be in relationship to is inherently full of change, and therefore we need to like be in like, you know, do those definitions help us? I don't know. Do those disciplines help us grow, or to say, you know, this person is an environmentalist and I'm an artist, and you know, like creating those binaries or dichotomies, it does help us specialize and honor people's histories
and expertise
and expertise. I mean, 100%. And how do we weave those parts of ourselves together so that there can be greater conversation across discipline? And that the Sealer project is so fascinating, thinking about, you know, how when labels came in, that actually created a separation. It created a collision of intention and actual, like, what happened, impact. And I think that there's a lot there that I would love to flesh out more.
And yet now, to circle back to something else we were talking about, I realized I just fell victim to the idea of prioritizing product and even sharing that with you, because the like physical or practical loss is ticket sales, right? And that play has, you know, lived on in all of these different ways in my classrooms, in my relationship with Chantal, like, and climate change theater action. And so I think that's why I struggled with that question, is I don't feel like I have a negative relationship to,
but you learn something
of it.
Like this whole discussion now about, like, I guess, you know, we can call it packaging, which is a very consumerist and like capitalistic phrase, but I do feel that it applies.
It's the invitation again, right? You're talking about like marketing language.
Of like how to get people in there. Anyway,
I wanted to just like go back to your original question and honor that, like, I don't know, dissatisfaction is okay to feel,
part of it.
and like as someone that definitely like wrestles with perfection, or like has over time, like that there are times when I feel disappointed, you know, and that's real, and it has nothing to do with really probably ever anybody else, but more about an expectation I had of myself as inside of a process. And so I feel like specifically like naming a process, I don't know if I can do that so much, but I definitely can tell when like certain priorities in my artistic process will get product oriented, and that's when I often lose interest or feel other motivations leading me that feel that feel actually truncating of like the potential of the project. And I actually then lean on my collaborators more to help me like come back to the present and come back to the questions and come back to like what it could be versus what I imagine it is, or like check, I did that.
What it was supposed to be.
Right, or like whatever, even sometimes it's unconscious, right? Like with the thing that I am seeking or like wanting to hear or wanting to feel or wanting to, and then I'm like, oh, actually, lean on you so that I can, like learn something new about what I thought I knew, but no, I don't know. And so there's something there that, yeah, it's very humbling in artistic process that I've grown to like, recognize more in myself as like necessary.
Yeah,
that I can't do it alone. That there's no, I'll be just more dissatisfied each and every process if I try to do something without my collaborators. It's not possible, like you said.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, I mean, there was a time when I, like, maybe when I was much younger and less mature, like, where I felt like if only I could control everything. Like, people don't understand, like, the thing I'm trying to do, and, like, I have to explain stuff, and then when the performance happens, it doesn't go the way, like, I want it to go, and then, like, I realized, like, I mean, yeah, part of it involved me changing my approach to composition, to acknowledge those X factors more, and also to more honor the people who I'm working with, more, and to talk more, and to to not think of, like, to kind of have almost like an anti-textual approach to composition, even though I am, in a way, the score is a text, and it's still like kind of my most comfortable way of working, but like I try to see it as a script that's very flexible. So yeah, I appreciate that. Anything else that you'd like to say? I think this might be a good place to leave it before we wrap up.
Can I shout out Climate Change Theater Action?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Yes, please, absolutely. Tell us all your stuff and where people can learn more. And
So this is a biennial festival of plays that Chantal Bilodeau, among others, who comprise now the Arts and Climate Initiative, work in collaboration with the Center for Sustainable Practice in the Arts to commission 50 plays from playwrights representative of all human inhabited continents to coincide with the Conference of Parties in the UN. And so between about now, late September, early October, and mid-December, they make these plays radically accessible to anyone who wants to work with them, play with them, bring them to their community. And the only ask is that at least one of the plays is read, embodied, staged in some way, and that there's consideration toward action. So the action part being anything in relationship to a local concern, maybe bringing in, again, an interdisciplinary perspective to spark conversation. And it's been a biennial production since 2015, and I love to work with it. I guess the normative word would be produce with our students at Boston Conservatory. So it'll be November 19th this year.
Of this year. That's amazing. Great.
Yeah. And the theme this year is All Good Things Must Begin, and it's in honor of Octavia Butler.
Cool. Awesome.
Oh, I can't wait.
I'm really excited for that, and actually one of the very first pieces from that project I was drawn to was a piece of music I'm forgetting the title of now, but it was repurposing the song. Someone was playing it on the piano, and they play as many notes as species of animals.
Wow.
Have been
Yeah,
lost.
sure.
And so it started, and again, I'm blanking on the title of it, but I knew it. It was like ambient for me.
Yeah.
And when it stopped, and that was just I'm mentioning that only to emphasize the pieces are short. They are cross-disciplinary and emotionally effective.
Wow. Allie, anything to add?
Well, I think that right now, I just want to really plug the idea of like working outside.
Yes.
And letting nature be source material and a driving force for creating narrative of any kind, or creating music, just being in relationship to the unexpected. And I don't have a specific project I want to shout out to right now, but just more like a way of working that feels like I just want to support, you know? And if anyone ever wants to talk about that, I would love to. It's like one of my favorite things to talk about.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Well,
Thank
and I'll
you,
share
Ryan.
information
Thanks
about all
for
this. And
inviting us into conversation is so meaningful.
that's totally my pleasure. Thank you so much. And I think, yeah, I'm sure our listeners really appreciate that. So thanks.
Thank you again.
Nice.